If you want a real conspiracy, okay, here's
Yeah.
a real conspiracy. Eventually, I realized what I need from the Bible is right there in the text itself. It's what it says. It's not a special hidden code that's underneath or inside it. You should be real honest with yourself about how much you are becoming dependent on whatever it is that you're getting into. How much time are you really spending trying to figure out what's really going on in the world versus in God's Word?
Hey, Clint, what are we talking about today?
Today, we're talking about conspiracy theories.
My favorite topic ever. I actually think it's going to be a little bit like, to the people that love conspiracy theory content, you know, all the YouTube videos and stuff, it's going to be a little deflating for those people potentially, because we're not sharing a conspiracy theory. We're not here to like.
Oh, we might.
Okay, great. I can't wait.
We might. Well, maybe I would start by asking, have you ever really gotten into a conspiracy theory?
Yeah.
Are you into one right now?
Well, okay, like on a really superficial level, like I wish the Loch Ness Monster were true. I know that sounds dumb, but like cryptozoology has always been so interesting to me. I think that counts as conspiracy theory because it runs the gambit of like, like a platypus at one time was a cryptozoological creature people didn't believe in. It was fantastical. Now we know that's real. But then there's like the chupacabra, you know, and there's the Loch Ness Monster and there's Bigfoot and there's all this stuff. I'm super fascinated in all that stuff. And I kind of wish the Loch Ness Monster were true. Does that count?
That's very interesting. Yeah. I guess we should say, because of what show this is, we're going to bring this around to the Bible and Christianity. And why this is a relevant topic to talk about. But that's an interesting beginning, because I always think back to, I loved my local library. I spent hours there as a kid. And I never really got into, say, books on conspiracy theories, but I did love books on mysteries. And those included, cryptozoology. Who doesn't want Nessie to be a real creature? And I was shocked too. And I found out, I was probably an adult when I found out that gorillas were cryptozoological until like I'll probably get this wrong, but I think the mid 1850s.
Yeah, pandas too, around that same time period.
Much later than you would think. They were in the Bigfoot category, and then we find out that they're real. So this is an interesting topic. It sometimes feels as if this has become a bigger thing in our lifetimes, or at least the last 70 years or so. It's probably always been around somewhat. Some people who come from different parts of the world seem to think it's a more American thing than not, I suppose.
Yeah, and it seems like there's a level of severity that you can kind of fall into a little bit with it too. Like the Loch Ness Monster to me is fun, but I also want it to be real. Like I do watch videos every once in a while of like someone hunting it or dropping sonar into the loch and just seeing things. Like I think that's really fun.
Right.
But it's also like it doesn't take over my life. You know?
Right. Exactly.
That might be where it gets into the Christian thing a little bit too, because like, or why it's important, you know, because I don't really want things to take over my life, but I also don't want to be deceived into thinking that things are or are not true, that are or are not true, right?
Right. So that might be a good time for me to read a quote here. And I think I will leave his name off to explain that part of what precipitated this was we did the episode on aliens.
Yeah.
And we didn't come out and just say, we can prove that no aliens have ever existed.
Right.
We didn't do that. And this was a challenge for some people who wrote in. And this is actually a friend of mine who is a pastor for our church. And his wife had written to us about this, because this gets into this area that they in their pastorate can see as a legitimate challenge, a real challenge. And so I was corresponding with him this week. I'll just read to you this one comment that he wrote to me. I can verify the biblical warnings on the topic. In terms of impact, the introduction to and investigation into conspiracy theories threatens to consume the life of the person and those in their family congregation. At best, it causes distraction or division, and at worst, it destroys lives. So
that's big.
Yeah. This is what he and his wife have seen in their experience in ministry. And I've seen some of that too. So that's part of why I was excited to do this episode and to talk about it. I thought maybe it would be interesting to just for me to reflect a little bit on my own background. I mentioned I liked mystery books. I liked trying to figure out what happened to these ships and planes that disappeared. What was the deal with the Bermuda Triangle and all of that? And when I was a teenager in the mid 90s, there were a couple books that came out on the Bible in particular called The Bible Code, or Variations on the Bible Code. And it seemed like this really awesome idea that you could go back to the first 5 books of the Bible and you could look, if you skipped every, say, 60 letters equally, that you could find words that corresponded to things that had happened in the news in the 90s. And it was amazing. It blew my mind.
Yeah.
Now I'm talking in the past tense, which probably shows I'm foreshadowing something here, which is that time went on, people tested the ideas in these books and they demonstrated a few things about them. They showed that you could do the same technique on Moby Dick or other literature. It was really a statistical trick. It was kind of like the birthday paradox. Do you know about the birthday paradox? It's the idea of how many people, say, in a college class, do you have to have before you're going to have two people with the same birthday?
Right. Like it just happens all the time that you're meeting someone with your same birthday, or 2 people have the same birthday and you're like, whoa, like this is just...
Right, exactly. When
this is far beyond coincidence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You might first think, well, maybe I need 365 people for that to be likely. And then you say, no, maybe it's probably half that. Maybe the class size has to be 182 people for it to be likely that people have the same birthday, but it's 23.
Yeah.
Once you get above 23, you are more likely than not to have 2 people with the same birthday. And to most people, that feels low, you know, or at least if you were in that class and then you found 2 people that had the same birthday, it would feel like, oh, wow, this is kind of special, isn't it? But the problem...
I've had that before. Like I've literally been in a class where I was like, same birthday? And we were like best friends because of this. Like it feels silly now, but like, yeah, at the time it was just, what are the odds of this happening?
Exactly. Turns out they're not too bad.
Yeah.
Actually, because we just aren't equipped to deal with statistics very well. We are expecting that we're looking at the coincidence of a specific thing happening, but we're really looking at the coincidence of anything interesting whatsoever to us happening.
Right.
And that's a much wider circle. So it depends. It's almost inevitable that's going to happen. In other words, with a birthday thing, we're not looking for a specific day to have the same birthday on. We're looking for any day to have the same birthday on. And the math just works out really differently because of that. And so with the Bible code stuff, it was all kind of built on this fallacy. And it was helped by things like Hebrew itself. As you know, it doesn't have vowels, which means that if you skip letters, and a lot of the words are just 3 letters, you're a lot more likely to be able to put together things that are words that you then fill in the vowels that you need, you know, in order for it to say what you want it to say.
Yeah.
And so the whole thing collapsed. But this was a good example where I went into the rabbit hole and I didn't go very far in. I was able to come back out easily because I didn't get super invested in it. I was sad when I found that out. You know, eventually I realized what I need from the Bible is right there in the text itself. It's what it says. It's not a special hidden code that's underneath or inside it.
Yeah.
So that was an important moment for me. But I have some sympathy then and understanding of that.
Well, I want to push back a little bit here because there is a balance, right? Like I know when I started studying the Bible for myself, I did see things where I was like, wow, I've never studied it like this before. I've never known to look at context or the depth that a word can have, or, you know, things like that, that it's not that they're secret, they're readily available, but they do still, they have that same feeling behind them. It's like, wow, like I'm looking at this in a whole new light, even though I'm not getting new teaching or, you know, some new learning or some special knowledge, it still accomplishes that same thing. You know? So can you talk about that balance a little bit? Because
there are treasures new and old in Scripture that open up, and there's just more and more depth that we find when we read the Bible. I love that feeling. I still have that feeling every day when I read the Bible.
But sometimes I go to people with that, and they're like, "Ooh, you're on dangerous ground here," and I'm like, "No, like I'm not into like these conspiracy things. I'm just trying to look at the context, right?"
Right, but part of that's because they have seen people be on dangerous ground and go in some bad directions with that. So I think one thing that you're kind of hitting at that is an element in conspiracy theories. I kind of put conspiracy theory motivations in two broad categories, and they're not exclusive. They can both be present. The one that you're talking about here is the thrill, that sense of specialness when you have discovered something. Maybe God has opened your mind to this one thing. Maybe you're one of the first people who has ever understood this.
Yeah.
Or maybe you are now belonging to a small group of people who understand this.
Yeah, you're all awake and everybody else is asleep, and
Right.
it feels good to finally be like broken out of that state of ignorance or whatever.
Right. That can feel so special. And for instance, me with the Bible code thing, I started to feel that, but I didn't become dependent on that, attached to that, which is what happens when you keep going back and reinforcing and reinforcing. And you keep looking for more and more evidence that supports this idea.
Did you share it with other people?
I probably did. I don't remember. I'm sure I did.
I think that entrenches us. Like I have a quote on my fridge that I'm going to butcher, but it says something about men at ease with the greatest problems in life find it nearly impossible to get rid of ideas that are proven wrong once they've begun to teach them.
Right.
And that is so true. Like once you've shared with somebody, like look at this amazing thing, to walk that back, it's like impossible or difficult anyways.
To prepare for this podcast, I assigned you a book reading thing, as we often do to each other.
Yeah.
And the book that I assigned you was Escaping the Rabbit Hole by Mick West, which I've read a couple times now. I've actually found it very helpful, but he has several parts. I snipped out some parts here, but now my notes so long I might not even find them in there. But he spoke to so many people who come out of the rabbit hole, and he interviewed them, and they said that, just what you said about where you get stuck is you get invested. You have so many Thanksgiving dinners that you've had with your family where you were making the case why Building 7 of the World Trade Center, was an inside job, it's demolition or something like that. That once someone shows you the evidence that invalidates that, I remember specifically, I thought of that example because he was telling the story of somebody who had gone way in on 9/11 inside job conspiracies, and he'd come out of it, and he was trying to talk to one of the people who was kind of in his in group, and he saw there was this person, he saw it in real time, him realize that the evidence didn't work anymore, and the guy just started screaming.
Yeah.
I mean, he was I think partly screaming at the guy and screaming at himself because he was realizing now he's got to go back and undo all those Thanksgiving dinners where where he had really invested in it.
And he doesn't feel as special anymore like he did before. Like he's right back where he started, which doesn't feel satisfying like it did when he was down the rabbit hole.
Right. I think that specialness is a part, but then that part where you invest is where it becomes a huge embarrassment, is where it really becomes difficult. The other major category I would see in this is fear, where we live in such a strange, chaotic world now where we can't figure out what people's motivations are, that this is a way that people feel like they can regain control a lot of times. Yeah,
I was just talking with someone recently, actually, because I feel like the news is just so full of kind of like bait for this kind of thinking, right? And someone asked me recently about studying prophecy. They said, I just want to because I really want to know what's going on in the world right now. And I said, okay, well, sometimes prophecy can be helpful for that, but I don't know that it's going to give you some special insight on this government project or this evil individual or some secret conspiratorial group. Like, that's not really the point of prophecy. And this person, it was interesting because they, on one hand, believed that there were like groups of people pulling the strings behind every little thing that happened that were just super geniuses that were thinking hundreds of years in advance and had all these plans and controlled the messaging of everything. And yet they thought that they had figured it out. And I was like, wait a minute, are they super geniuses or are you able to figure it out from a Netflix special? Like, which one is it? And that dissonance was not comfortable. So it was just like, okay, we have to break apart the conversation.
Right.
Because I can't sit in both places where super geniuses rule the world and nobody's figuring it out, but I can from, some documentary I saw one time. Like, Okay, how do you hold both of those?
Then you've got to figure out, once you figure it out, what are you going to do
Yeah.
with that?
Right.
Are you going to go stop them, or
Right. Yeah.
what's going to happen there? I think one thing that's challenging about this too is that we're all very skeptical because real conspiracies are out there.
Yeah.
We have seen them before. The tobacco companies conspired to cover up how dangerous smoking was for many years. There have been real false flag incidents in the 20th century, or at least documents where we found out ones were being considered, even if they were never followed through on.
Yeah.
And so people have all of this suspicion about those things, and they jump straight from that to past the evidentiary stage to, well, there's where there's smoke, there's fire, and they see smoke everywhere.
It feels safer, in other words, to, it's like we know that there are people that don't have your best interest in mind. We know there are people that work for their own gain, and you might get, rolled over in the process. We know those things happen, that cover-ups happen, that secrets go on. But when you don't know which one to label that, it's just safer to label everything that.
Right.
Because you're afraid that you might not be aware, or you might be caught unawares if you don't.
Right. I was talking to somebody close to me about we won't get into the Jeffrey Epstein thing specifically. Most people have heard what that is. But they were asking me then about going back to the Pizzagate thing of 2016, and they said, Does this mean that's true too? Mm-hmm. It's natural to do that, isn't it? Or at least it's mentally natural for us to then we want to follow the trajectories, mm-hmm. and I think that's where we have to stop ourselves and say, well, we are still bound by evidence. That at the end of the day, the Bible talks about it. You need 2 or 3 witnesses. It sets up an evidentiary trail for mm-hmm. things. You cannot get around that.
Right.
And so just because one thing seems to vindicate you, it doesn't mean that all the rest of the things that people have said for maybe good or nefarious reasons are actually true.
That's really good, actually. It's like, well, someone's on trial. I've never murdered before. It's like, well, it doesn't really mean that you didn't do it right now. Or, someone murdered 5 times. It's like, man, they're innocent until they're proven guilty. Like, it's good that we have those boundaries in place, I think, from a moralistic standpoint, right? To say, okay, like, you can't just label with a broad brush, guilty, innocent, evil, innocent, right? It requires evidence. And while that might not be as grabby a headline, there's a lot of safety in that as well that you might not expect.
Right. So we do need to stay tied to the idea of truth and evidence. Truth can be known. Some people on the right will criticize people on the left for what we call your truth, my truth, the idea mm-hmm. that truth is all relative. Yeah. But then sometimes people on the far right can sort of take this view. They say all truth is in the Bible, and they'll miss things like the Bible saying, if you want to find out if I slapped you yesterday, where are your witnesses? They witness something that you can't go look up in the Bible, but the Bible says is true. Or just all the books the Bible cites for evidence. I counted them up a few months ago. I think we were talking about that once. I forget how many, over 30, I think, books that the Bible itself cites to say, hey, if you want to find out if this is true or not, go look it up in that book. So,
like the books Bible, of wars that they had documented, or like Jasher, like things that they had at their time.
Right. Yeah. When we have the passage that says your word is truth, it's saying everything in your word is true, but that doesn't mean that the Bible doesn't exist within a larger world where there are truths that you can verify and test. And the reason that's important is because if you don't have that element, people start denying things that you can verify. That's where you can get into, say, a flat Earth scheme. Kind of depends on saying, well, all of this is false. Don't even believe your eyes over here. Mm-hmm. You just your world becomes very small.
Yeah.
Then.
Yeah. So even you're denying your senses, and that's the crazy part. It's like the Bible doesn't say. Actually, maybe it does somewhere, but I was going to say the Bible doesn't say that the grass is green, but you can still observe that the grass is green. It's not incompatible with what Scripture says.
It says the heavens declare God's glory.
Right.
And there are passages like that are basically God inviting you to say, just go out and look. If you want some proof about me, go out and look with your own eyes and see, hear with your own ears. That's how John made his case that what you're reading is true about what he and the other disciples went through with Jesus. He said, "Look, we saw him,
We
we
touched
touched
him.
him."
Yeah.
That's how he starts his first epistle that way. So this is evidence. You can start with having a meeting of the minds on what's actually factual or not factual. So I think that's really important. I wonder if I could talk about this book a little bit more.
Yeah.
Escaping the Rabbit Hole. There's some things that I really enjoyed about it when I went through it that were surprising for me. I think one thing that was encouraging in a way, and is maybe not what people expect, is that for people who've never gotten into conspiracy theories, it can sometimes seem like there's a certain sort of person who's a conspiracy theorist. And that's been supported by lots of news stories that have said, well, we think conspiracy theorists are more this way or that way, or these ways that they'll analyze it. But the studies that have really been done in it have shown that by and large, people who get into conspiracy theories are you and me. They're just like us at perhaps a different point in our lives. You may yet get into a conspiracy in the future.
Yeah.
But the positive thing about that is it means that you can come out of it too. And so this book, Escaping the Rabbit Hole, is written by this man who has run a website for many years where he communicated with thousands of people on a number of conspiracy theories. And he kind of took that and took emerging science and put it together in this book to help people talk to a family member or a friend and help them, nudge them out of the rabbit hole if that's what they're in. So that was one of his insights, is that, look, that conspiracy theorists are just like you and me, and maybe they will be you tomorrow.
Right.
But it means that you can get out. But I'll go ahead.
I just had a question. Now, does he, because I know, like, I read the book, and it's interesting that he kind of in some ways encourages careful exploration of the presented information, right? He's not saying go down the rabbit hole to see for yourself, but he is saying if someone presents you with a rabbit hole to look into, be circumspect about it. Like, be careful about the information that you take in, but he never says avoid the discussion either. You know what I mean? He never says don't look into it because you'll fall in, right? He gives careful instruction on how to approach the conversation, how to approach the evidence and look into it, but it's not avoidance. And I think sometimes when these things can be very emotional, especially when you've seen someone go down those rabbit holes before, and you can start to avoid it so much so that it further entrenches that idea of only those people over there really get into them. We stay over here. We're safe over here. And it's like, that's not really the approach that the author takes in the book.
No, that was surprising to me too. His big thing was facts and evidence, that if you can continue to bring people the information that would show them the real truth about a matter, that will do work in time. His main points that he covers in the book, he talks about developing a clear understanding of what they're thinking and why, fostering trust and respect. In fact, as an example, he said this. He said, I learned many lessons while running Morgellons Watch, which was Morgellons is, well, you can look it up if you want to find out what that is. The most important one was to be polite and respectful to people that you disagree with. Nothing good comes of insulting someone, even unintentionally. So he said you never want to just be dismissive.
Yeah.
You want to actually meet them where they are. He says finding areas of agreement and recognizing their genuine concerns is really important. And then identifying mistakes in their beliefs or areas where they lack information, and then exposing them to new information to help them gain a more fact-based perspective. And he says, do it all with honesty and openness. And like you said, openness means saying, I'll come and reason with you. We'll sit down together.
You'll share this with me, and I'll read what you're reading from.
Right.
But I expect, you'll read what I'm presenting to you as well, the challenge that I'm putting forth to it.
Right.
Yeah. And I love what you're saying, because I'm a big apologetics guy. I love the world of apologetics, and this is what this sounds like to me. It even reflects that statement that Peter makes about doing all of this, giving the defense, giving the evidence with meekness and fear. Like that second half of that verse that we get the word apologia from, it's word for word what you're saying here, but we're applying the concept to topics that are out there on the internet or on
Right.
TV or whatever.
Other matters of truth
Yeah.
that are less significant than the truth of the Bible, but which have the potential to pull you away from even considering the truth of the Bible or completely distract you from it, which is one of the big problems there. And he really focused too on giving it time, because I think this is where a lot of people, if you have been on the other side of this with someone who's a conspiracy theorist, it feels like you try and it completely fails, and
Yeah.
you say, well, I'm never doing that again. And you
Yeah.
don't realize you actually are planting seeds that could bear fruit in time
Yeah.
if you just continue with honesty and openness and patience and let the facts do their work.
I think that is what I respected most about the book in general, was just the respect that he had for people. And he continued to call them, if your friend thinks
Right.
this or believes this, here's what you should say or do. And that I also really appreciated that he said, sometimes change does not look like it's happening in a person when you're confronting them about these things respectfully, but it might be internally, and that it might switch visibly kind of all at once.
Right.
Even though it doesn't internally, that person's taking what you're saying into consideration, and that challenge is actually being effective inside, but they might double down. They might look even more entrenched than they were before. So I know a person, like the reason that I found that approach helpful is because I know a person married to somebody that kind of fell down a religious rabbit hole where it kind of further and further isolated them away from people because they understand the truth of the matter. Nobody else does. Everyone else is blinded. And this person that I know reasons with them all the time and just gets so upset by the idea of, nothing's getting through, nothing's happening, nothing's working. They're just further and further down the rabbit hole than they've ever been before. And when I encourage them with those words like, hey, I know this book that you should check out. And his approach is sometimes that change is happening internally and you don't see it. She just broke down in like, thank you for telling me that that's what happens, because she had no encouragement that it was working, no encouragement. And to say, actually, this is what's going on in that person's mind, made her have hope. And I think that's what people need when they're encountering people that have these worldviews, is just some hope that they're not just stuck, And I think that's what I really appreciated about his approach to people down a rabbit hole, was not one of condemnation or defamation at all.
Right. I appreciate you bringing up the your friend thing. Always remembering your friend. This is what friends are for.
Yeah.
is helping them, and you're helping them just like they might help you in the same way at some point. If I could read another quote from this that I think is relevant to that. He said, "Conspiracy theorists flourish in walled gardens. When asked where they get their news, they will often point only to alternative fringe sites like Alex Jones' InfoWars, or more esoteric conspiracy theory sites like, he named some other sites, or even David Ickey's reptilian Illuminati-related news." And he says, Cass Sunstein and Adrian Vermeule describe this as a crippled epistemology, simply defined as having a sharply limited number of relevant informational sources. You can be a new information source for your friend, but it's equally important that you introduce them to or help rehabilitate other relevant information sources. And then he says, in giving it time, in this one person's case, Stephanie, who we interviewed here, he said, Stephanie's case illustrates so well that it takes time, and every little bit has some effect. You just can't fully see that effect until the person emerges into the light. We should expect that our seemingly logical and fact-based points will initially be rejected. The important thing is to keep the discussion going. Now, I would like to talk about the spectrum that he sets in that book. I thought this was one of the most fascinating things. So could I share that
Yeah.
with you here? What he realized from talking to many, many conspiracy theorists over time was that we all have a spectrum of extremeness for conspiracy theories. And he plotted them out from 1 to 10. And what he found was we all have the same spectrum, basically. For us, wherever we are on that spectrum, he found that people usually have a demarcation line of what is a little bit too far for them, what's just not reasonable. And they tend to believe all the conspiracy theories on the higher side of that demarcation line,
Right.
and they don't believe any of the ones on the lower side, and that shocked me. I would not have expected that. I would have thought, okay, you have people who are into this, you have people who are into that. They're not mutually into the same ones.
Right.
But it seemed like everybody's got this same scale, and this is the scale. Number one is things like big pharma, basically various conspiracies. The idea that pharmaceutical companies are conspiring somehow to maximize their profits by selling drugs that people don't actually need. He said most of us believe in some form of this
Yeah.
or of some form or another. Number two are global warming hoaxes. The idea that climate change is not caused by man-made carbon emissions and that there's some other motive for claiming that. Number three is JFK assassination theories. Number four is things like 9/11 was an inside job. Number five is chemtrails. You get up to six, you have false flag shootings, which is things like the Sandy Hook shooting and other mass shootings are either somehow some kind of false flag is it's an attempt to pose something that is different than what really happened. Like this person was a Manchurian candidate type person who they programmed to do this thing so that they could then say outlaw all guns or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Or the extreme versions of that is that these mass shootings didn't even happen at all, and that
Right.
all the witnesses are lying and all the television footage is lying.
So even within each single stage along this line, there's a spectrum within that of what people believe on it.
Right.
Yeah.
So a lot of these are sort of narrow, and then others of them are very wide, and you could be, from 1 to 10 anywhere on this. 9/11 is a good example of that because it's that same kind of thing where on the narrow end there's people, or on the higher end there's people who feel, well, maybe the government knew something about this ahead of time, or at least they capitalized on 9/11 to do things that they wanted to do.
Yeah.
And then way on the other end, you've got people all the way down to where they say, that a plane didn't hit the Pentagon. A plane didn't even hit the World Trade Center towers. And these 10,000 witnesses in New York are all making it up somehow. And so, within each one, you can have that spectrum. But they all kind of fall on this larger spectrum. You get to number 7, and you have things like the moon landing hoax. Number 8 is UFO cover-ups. Number 9 is flat Earth. And number 10 is reptile overlords. This idea that goes back to, I believe the guy's name is David Icke, and legends that he drew on before that they're lizard people who go back to an alien.
Yeah, I've seen videos of that before, or like claimed videos, right? Of like, oh, look, that guard in the president's entourage like is a reptile person or whatever. And you're like, okay,
right.
Wow. Like to me, that's probably far down the list of like, that sounds out there.
Yeah, probably the best way to think about this 1 to 10 list, I suppose, is that the farther you are, down that or up in numbers, are the more sets of things out in the world that are observable that you have to filter out or completely throw out in order to keep the theory working. Especially when you get down to flat Earth or lizard people, there's just so much to that.
So it's a level of openness, though, right? I mean, if you're on 10, you're like, yeah, lizard people, that's a legitimate thing. You're pretty much open to the ways in which people believe about all of the other ones as well.
Exactly. People who, so the point of the scale is if you're flat Earth at 9, you probably also believe 9/11 was an inside job and that there's a cover up with JFK's assassination. Almost every time that's the case, it seems like.
But if you're on the 9/11 side and you're one who says, I think the government probably knew something, and that's your line.
Right.
Everybody else on the other side of it that says it was planned, it didn't actually happen the way you think it happened, those people are crazy to you. That's how you view them.
Right. Then you probably would not believe in the moon landing hoax, or you're less likely to, or that kind of thing. He did mention there's a lot of overlapping relationships between them, in that, say, chemtrails may be spraying poison to help Big Pharma sell more drugs. JFK might have been killed because he was going to reveal that UFOs were real. Like, these things tend to fold back in on themselves and become one, coherent other narrative of how everything has happened.
Yeah.
And so there's a big portion of that. But the reason why that's so valuable, the reason I read that list, was I was fascinated by his idea of the demarcation line. Because what he found from a lot of experience was that when people are willing to consider questions about things right around their demarcation line. If they're into chemtrails, for instance, this idea that planes are spraying chemicals rather than just leaving ice crystals behind the plane like we know they do, then what will likely happen is they'll be with groups of people who get into this, and then those groups of people will often offer something that's just like the next stage, like Sandy Hook false flag shootings. And that's the part where there's just a little too much evidence for them.
Yeah.
And they start looking at that and they start critically questioning it. And once they start that critical process and they sort of go there and they dip their toe and they come back and they say it's not evidence, that starts to create a little bit of momentum in their ability to reconsider critically things that they would not have been willing to reconsider before. They might start to think, well, this person, they were really into chemtrails along with me, and now I see that they took this leap too far, and I can see the problem inside their reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I should reevaluate what they told me about chemtrails. And as they start to do that, it starts to create the momentum that this person needs to climb back out of the rabbit hole, because people can only bring themselves out of the rabbit hole. You can't pull somebody out. They have to climb out.
What's kind of funny though is I'm thinking about this right now, and the fact that you listed all of those very specifically, like even in my own mind and just knowing people in my life, there's things you listed that I know may immediately discredit what you're saying because that's where their demarcation line is. People I know
Right.
that are good, normal, rational people, but they have these things where it's just like, well, you listed that as a conspiracy theory, but that's common sense.
Right. Like I just said, ice crystals are what come off of airplanes.
Right. I know people that believe in chemtrails, and they're just like, that's way far down the line. You're kidding me. Like that.
Right.
You're listing that as something to be debunked, but that's just information I know.
That was one of the most interesting parts of the book. And part of the reason I wanted to read this list is if you are somewhere if anybody listening is somewhere on this list, like I am too, I have my suspicions about Big Pharma. I'll put it that way.
You put yourself comfortably at the top of the list.
I don't want to say exactly where I am in this list. But if you find yourself somewhere in this list, and we pretty much all do, I would recommend this book. You can get it for free probably from your library. We listen to a lot of books on Hoopla through our libraries. Here in Ohio, we have that. So you can listen to it, you can find it, because he goes through most of the ones in that list, and he really gives a deep dive on it. So if you're up to the challenge, take a look at what he has to say. On that one, it's interesting with the chemtrails. That was one of the ones I was most interested in because of the way that he went about it. He spends a lot of time on the science of atmosphere and jet engines and low bypass jet engines and things like that. But the most compelling thing was where he just went back and found every book on clouds he possibly could from the last 80 years and collected them. And they would usually have a part in there where they talked about contrails, because contrails are clouds, and it would explain how they work, how they interact. And when you just read what these books that were printed decades ago said, they usually invalidate all the primary claims that are made by the development of the chemtrails idea. And so he recorded a video of himself just opening these books, book after book, and reading them. And he said that was one of the most effective things, it seemed like, for many people, was just they had never been confronted by that before. It was just a lack of, not access to evidence, but a lack of looking at the evidence.
Yeah.
It's
like, when I see things that are like investigative journalism, they have such a wonderful knack of telling a story. And that's kind of what some of these things seem like. It's like people are presented with evidence that looks a lot like investigative journalism. Like, look, I saw this and it led me to this. And if you're not going to deny this, then it's really not far to go to this thought over here.
Right.
And suddenly that begins to build a case in their minds that's very hard to topple. And so presenting evidence to the contrary of that can be very hard to challenge that, because it really is all built upon each other, right? It's like this contained building that these people have spent and invested time like constructing. And it looks very convincing when you put it like that. But when you start showing like, but here's how that doesn't fit with other things that you actually believe, or here's how that building topples when you also consider this thing that you know to be true.
Right.
You know?
they're operating in a walled garden and they don't realize they are. But one thing that probably gives them suspicion about that is because they look around at all the rest of us and they say, well, people aren't really critically thinking about things. They're the only ones who are.
Right.
And the reason that feels true is because there's a lot of that is true. Like none of us are really critically thinking about a lot of things
Yeah, right.
very well. We're pretty bad at that, but we all overestimate our own ability to do it. And so a lot of the problem is that often they're right. People don't have as much information about each one of these things. And there are things that we don't know. But where they go wrong is they think they're doing that balanced critical analysis when actually they're just doing sort of the opposite flip side version of most of our non-relationship with a lot of these stories.
It's probably worth saying too, like the book that you recommended, I enjoyed it a lot, but it's not a Christian author thinking through a biblical lens
Right.
at all. So there's going to be stuff in there that even just in his language and his speech, whatever. I just want to make that clarification
Yeah,
because
that's
some
a good
people
point.
are going to.
There's a few bad words in there, not from him, but from the people that he quotes.
Yeah.
He's not a Christian as far as actually he doesn't really say anything either way on it.
No, it's
I
just
got the
not through a
feeling he's
Christian
not.
lens, though. Like that's
No,
not
it's
really
not.
how he's operating.
Yeah, he's a retired video game designer who then kind of took this up as a second career, just out of interest.
So real quick, we've kind of zoomed way out, and we've looked at different conspiracy theories. We've kind of understood the concept of rabbit holes in general. We've looked at why this is important to consider from a Christian lens because it can be a thing that takes over. We've looked at how you approach people that are maybe down these rabbit holes. Now what? Like what's the takeaway from all of this?
The takeaway, I would say, one thing that is making all of this more difficult, I think, is the algorithms that we are all exposed to on the internet. If you want a real conspiracy, okay, here's a real conspiracy, and it's provable. It is how these algorithms, and it's not even necessarily a nefarious person or some nefarious evil AI that's doing it. It's just AI operating on big data to try to figure out what YouTube video to put in that little tray next to you. And what they found by observing what it does is that it carefully feeds you a very steady, perfectly sloped avenue down into the rabbit hole of more and more extreme things. It's not trying to, it's just...
Yeah, there's not a will behind that.
No.
You're actually the one... it's natural for you to be intrigued by a certain topic, but the longer you hang on that, the more it's going to give you the next level because it knows you're intrigued.
It's mathematically just feeding your own human nature back to you.
Right.
Is all that it's doing. And so these algorithms are a huge problem. So I would say a big takeaway, here's one question somebody asked me before doing this. They asked me, but shouldn't we be warning our friends and family about these dangers? And there are times that we should. There are things that turn into public health crises that sometimes the evidence comes out and there's enough evidence to go on that you should warn your family and friends in 1960 that they shouldn't be smoking, probably. Those are things that you can know in advance. But I would say that when it comes to understanding our role as Christians, where this all fits into our life, you should be real honest with yourself about how much you are becoming dependent on whatever it is that you're getting into. You can start by doing a personal audit of saying, how much time am I spending, say, taking in news sources from my favorite newsletters or from news sites versus reading the Bible? I think most of us, when we're asked that question, and pastors ask it all the time in sermons, we think, I'm probably not doing that great. I have a feeling if you actually tracked it, you're probably doing way worse than you even think that you are. Like, how much time are you really spending trying to figure out what's really going on in the world versus in God's word? The other side of that too is can you take a break? What happens when you take a digital fast? Can you take a week off from reading any news at all? What happens to you? Do you experience any kind of a withdrawal symptom from that? That's going to tell you something about whether you're really doing this to serve mankind or whether this is starting to fill something that you may not say you need it, but it's becoming sort of a need that you're filling.
I think for the first point you said, I want to make a clarification too, because I think sometimes people, you can always spend more time in God's word, like
right.
You can always look at your life and say, I could be doing more there. But I think often that phrasing can turn into people obsessing over that too. Like, well, if 50% of my life's not spent reading my Bible and I'm not doing enough, or could it be 51%? Could it be 52%? I think while it's an important question to ask, considering how much time are you consuming this as opposed to this, like that's a good question. But even, someone could be consuming a ton of Bible, but it's being colored by how they are viewing the other material, right? Does that make sense? Like that's just a little bit of a caveat to say the amount you're studying your Bible does not necessarily mean that you are safe from every rabbit hole thinking that you could possibly go down.
I would say that's probably true, but I would say that it's probably a pretty good proxy anyway, because people who get pulled into this starts to replace what God designed the Bible to offer them. And so
what God designed the Bible to offer them, but that's sometimes the thing that gets skewed. A person can be down the rabbit hole on a biblical topic, and they're studying their Bible all the time, but it's through the wrong lens. It's coloring their study in the wrong direction,
That's a good point. Yeah, that does come down to the question of what are you actually using God's word for? And that is something that I wanted to address in this that I think is really important, which is you need to make sure that your faith is not a conspiracy theory, that your actual relationship to God and God's word does not operate just like a conspiracy theory does. You can two people can go to the same church and listen to the same sermons and go home and they count themselves as members of the same organization, but maybe one is attached to the vine and the other is not. Our faith is a living faith that involves actual relationship with our Father and with our elder brother, Jesus Christ. This relationship, that means you talk and there's actual communication, there's actual knowing happening. What people can do instead is rather than that, what they actually have is a whole bunch of set of ideas that they think are correct about the Bible and about God that other people don't know, because they have this knowledge, that's what has set them up for success. And then they've, what they have from the Bible is really not all that different than just another conspiracy theory. Mm-hmm. So they need to make sure that is a living and active relationship, not just things and then you go and find your tribe of people who think the same things about the Bible, and now you've got your super special group of people there.
Right.
Can't be a conspiracy theory. Another thing that I think that this comes down to, this is more on the fear side of it, the people who get into it because they want control, is that at some point you can't be holding on to every last thing where you're worried about somebody taking advantage of you over here, taking advantage over here. Jesus comes in and just blows that up in the Sermon on the Mount whenever he talks about being willing to let someone take advantage of you. Give him your cloak also. It's just such a different mindset that God demands to follow Jesus Christ. Puts you in this whole other zone of abundance rather than scarcity thinking, so that you start to realize, there are some things God can take care of. I don't want to be naive, but I also believe God can be my rear guard. If someone takes advantage of me, I can believe that God can make it right or supply me something else. Eventually you have to get to the point where you can live in a world of unknowns. It can't just be about, and this is where it connects back to the Aliens podcast, I think. At the end of the day, it can't just be about proving every conspiracy theory is true or not true. You're going to have to learn to live in a world where maybe somebody out there is taking advantage of you, but you've got a bigger job to do. You've got bigger fish to fry if you've been given God's Spirit and given his message and are expected to be a light in the world. Like that's job number one. That's what being an ambassador is that. It's tuning out other things that you could focus on that are maybe good, but not what you're supposed to be doing. Satan loves to distract us with things that are good, but are not the mission.
Yeah. I mean, you imagine there's Roman occupation in Israel, and there's taxes to be paid, and there's, this is a huge issue in Jesus' time.
Right.
Huge groups of poor are coming to him, struggling and trying to understand, what's coming? Are you going to be the Messiah that overthrows? Like, what's this exactly going to look like? And then Jesus says, consider the lilies.
Right.
And it's like, this is a completely different message. It still accomplishes the same thing of unburdening yourself of the worry that you had about who's taking what from you and how you're going to do this or that, right? But it does it in a completely different way. Classic Jesus fashion, where it's just not the answer you're expecting, but it is the answer you need.
Right, right. Somebody who knows he's going to go sacrifice himself for you has a whole different mindset than having a lot of those worries. And Paul follows the exact same path. You look at across his letters and you look at what he's telling people and you step back and say, well, what do I know about the first century? I bet there wasn't any intrigue going on in the Roman Empire during this time in any of these cities.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was.
Yeah,
And
tons of
everybody
it.
knew it. But what do you have in the letters? It's not all that stuff. It just isn't, because Paul and his audience, they know that they are on the winning team. They know their confidence is in the God who can raise you from the dead. And so they are able to go all in on what's actually real.
Yeah. And it makes that other stuff far less intriguing because it just doesn't have the substance that everything he's presenting does.
Right.
That's our podcast.